Bonjour tout le monde. Good afternoon. I'm Daniel Bélan. I'm the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. I'm really pleased to be here today for this very special event. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. It's important to us at MISC to recognize the significance of the land on which we work, study, and live, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are a part. We encourage everyone here today to seek out more spaces for learning and understanding the history of these territories. The McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, which is known as MISC, is the Center for Canadian, Quebec and Indigenous Studies programs here at McGill University. MISC supports a multidisciplinary approach to the study of Canada by bringing together students, researchers, and practitioners to discuss important issues about the country's past, present, and future. In addition to our academic programs, MISC also hosts public events such as the panel today. And these events are on a wide range of topics that are important for Canadians. And you can learn more about our activities, our forthcoming events, by visiting our website at mcgill.ca/misc, M-I-S-C. Je voudrais commencer en remerciant, en présentant notre modérateur, David Shribman. David was the executive editor of the Post-Gazette in Pittsburgh from 2003 to 2019. He writes a nationally syndicated column in the United States. He prepares a separate columns on American affairs, or Affairs in the Americas for the Globe and Mail. He's also a scholar in residence at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, and he teaches American politics at the Max Bell School of Public Policy here at McGill. David was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 1995 for his writing on Washington and the American political scene. He led the coverage of the Tree of Life Synagogue massacre that won the Pulitzer Prize 25 years later. So I will now turn to you, David. David is also a friend, a wonderful guy who's passionate about Canada, loves Canada. I think you have dual citizenship as well, if I recall properly. And David will introduce our panelists. Merci beaucoup, David.
Merci. Well, hello. But Daniel failed to mention that my greatest credential is that I'm the product of Canadian-American relations in the most literal sense. I have a Montreal mother and a Massachusetts father. So I really am the result of Canadian-American relations. Dan Bilefsky, right to my left. When I was editor of the Post-Gazette, people said that there was no one to my left, but nonetheless. Dan spent nearly 20 years as international correspondent for the New York Times in Paris, London, New York, Brussels, Istanbul, Prague, and Montreal. Previously a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. We were on the Wall Street Journal together, and the FT, and is author of a true crime thriller, The Last Job, which he's adapting for a podcast. He recently left the New York Times, and I wanted to tell Dan that as someone who left the New York Times, though under different circumstances, at age 30 I was fired for insubordination. I'm very proud of that. That the history of the Times is written by those of us who left it. In fact, I should also add that when I was, one of the reasons I was dismissed was when the Ontario-born editor of the New York Times summoned me to New York with the notion of promoting me and asked me where I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. And I said there was really only one place I wanted to go, and that was Montreal. And he said, "You're too young to die." Next is Emma Jacobs, Montreal-based freelance journalist who's worked in radio and podcasts for over a decade. She's covered Canada for NPR since 2019 and produced podcasts for organizations ranging from National Geographic to the Smithsonian Museum of American Art, and she's also worked for NPR member stations WHYY and WNYC. And also Amanda Coletta, who is the Toronto-based correspondent. She covers Canada and the Caribbean. I wonder what the editors of the Washington Post must know about geography. Canada and the Caribbean for the Washington Post. She previously worked in London, not the one in Ontario. First at The Economist, and then the Wall Street Journal, another former colleague. Coletta began her career as a freelance journalist covering the business and governance of sport for publications including Foreign Policy, which is known as a great sports magazine, the New York Times, which no longer has a sports section, the Globe and Mail, and the CBC. So, I don't know about you, but as an American and a Canadian, when I come here, I came here with a notion 5 years ago, every fall, that finally I'd be able to escape talking about Donald Trump. Instead, no conversation has anything to do with anything that doesn't involve Donald Trump. How much is Donald Trump, panelists, part of the conversation of the world you live in?
Well, certainly during my time at the New York Times, Donald Trump was omnipresent because famously, I think the New York Times had misread that election and touted Hillary Clinton as the winner. So I think the long shadow of Donald Trump, in addition to all of his machinations as president, the fact that the Times had gotten it wrong and had ignored the red states and that whole massive movement that crescendoed into his election was something that we all thought about. When I was Canada correspondent for the Times, certainly his Trudeau bashing gave me a lot of work. So I think he definitely is not someone who can be ignored.
He's a jobs program for journalists, I agree. Yeah. Emma?
I don't know that it comes up. I don't know that it comes up as often for me. I think often the stories that might rise to the level of interest of the outlets I work for might be where Canada acts as a foil for American politics, but I don't know that Americans care that much what Canadians think of
Sure.
of the, the current political reality.
And Amanda?
So I would say that certainly, like Emma said, a lot of interest in Canada and Trump sort of stemmed from to what extent Trudeau was trying to cast himself as a foil to Trump. And certainly any time that the Prime Minister made any sort of comment that seemed to criticize the former president, I'm thinking of there was that time where he gave a very long pause in response to a question about protests around police violence in the United States, where he managed to say nothing but the pause. Everybody was reading into this 20-second pause whatever they wanted, and people who saw the Prime Minister as a foil said, oh, look, this is the Prime Minister being a foil. I think also on the international desk at the Washington Post, around the election in 2020, there was a lot of interest in, what was the world's reaction to the election? What were, the op-ed pages and politicians in the different countries around the world, what were they saying before the election and after the election and after January 6th? So that's, sort of how it's, been present on my beat. And I imagine, going into the next year, it will be, to what extent are allied countries making preparations for a possible return of Trump?
It's my experience that Americans' views of Canada are frozen in the Jeanette MacDonald, Nelson Eddy era. How much do you think Americans know about Canada? And conversely, how much do you think Americans care about Canada? Why don't you start first, Amanda?
So I think it's probably fair to say that Canadians know more about the United States than Americans know about Canada. And I think that's a reflection of, this idea that when the United States sneezes, Canada catches a cold. Canada doesn't really have the luxury of sort of ignoring the major political debates in the United States because the ramifications are certainly felt here. But at the same time, I think if you look, a little more closely at which Americans we're talking about. Whenever I write a story about the border, whether it's trade at the border or migration at the border, debates over the Safe Third Country Agreement, and particularly during the pandemic, stories about restrictions at the border and when those might be eased and what the impacts of those were on both sides of the borders, the economies of those border states, but also the people who live there who have very close relationships with people on the other side. Those are some of the stories that got the most reader interest, and I'm not measuring that just in terms of clicks, but also in terms of people who wrote to me to share their own stories about what it's like to live in a border state. So I think people who live in border states probably know a little bit more about Canada than people elsewhere in the country. But I also think, educated professional readers know a bit about Canada. Lots of Americans visit Canada. So, I wouldn't want to paint Americans as a whole with a broad brush. But, also from my reporting, from speaking to diplomats who work in the United States at Canadian outposts there, certainly it is a challenge to keep Canada on the radar of policymakers in DC and elsewhere. And certainly, since the election in 2016, they've been making a much more deliberate effort to sort of, target lawmakers and states that do a lot of trade with Canada, target governors, and to kind of, keep Canada on the agenda. Because, of course, when lawmakers are thinking about the countries that border the United States, Mexico is much more something on their radar.
I think you covered that really well. I would really echo that. I think that there are distinctions between border regions where things are very integrated, and there's just much more of a sense of connection than areas further from it where people may think about Canada very little.
Dan?
I think Americans tend to think of Canada as a slab of Scandinavia on top of the United States and a place where they can go have poutine in a place that is sort of as close you're going to get to Europe in North America. At the same time, as Amanda alluded to, for the New York Times, Canada is the biggest digital subscription market outside the United States. And consistently during my 6 years as a Canada correspondent, our stories did very well compared to other parts of the world in terms of the clicks. So I wouldn't underestimate that. I would also not underestimate what I call the Trudeau factor. JT, for all of his the ambivalence that he inspires in Canada, is a popular kind of humanistic face on the global stage. And if you put Trudeau in a headline, people tend to read it. I'll tell a quick story that for me encapsulates my time as Canada correspondent. When Meghan and Harry moved to British Columbia, I wrote a story about them coming here, and on a Friday afternoon, correspondents at the Times write their own tweets, and in a moment of thoughtlessness, perhaps, I put my story on the New York Times Twitter feed, and I wrote, quote, I seem to recall, Harry and Meghan are coming to Canada, injecting the sprawling, bone-chillingly cold country with some razzle-dazzle. It seemed like an innocuous enough tweet to me. On Friday night, as I was watching Netflix, I glanced at my Twitter feed and noticed that Razzle Dazzle was trending in Canada. And I had 150,000 nasty hate messages. And then the next day, the whole thing, it became a meme. The Canadian Armed Forces tweeted, about Razzle Dazzle. Someone said, Dan Bilefsky has obviously not played bingo in Yukon, hashtag Razzle Dazzle. And much to my shock, I went to cover the Meng Wanzhou extradition hearing in Vancouver, turned on the news, and someone asked Justin Trudeau, why the New York Times thought Canada lacked Razzle Dazzle. So all by way of saying, it's sort of a frivolous episode, but on one hand, Canadians were so triggered because they thought I was American, and I was kind of tweeting on behalf of the New York Times, and so this notion of Canada as this large, country that's frigidly cold kind of plays into Canadians' insecurity about our identity. And at the same time, Americans kind of love the tweet, so it kind of embodied how Americans, for better or for worse, see Canada as this sort of sprawling country. The only caveat I would say to that is I think Canada is seen as a petri dish for progressive policies on human rights, on women's rights, on gay rights, et cetera. And in all my postings and all the places that David mentioned, Canada is held in a lot of esteem as this humanistic place on the global stage. And this is something that I think the Trump era only magnified.
I have my own story kind of like that, Dan. When I was at the Wall Street Journal for the Washington Correspondents Association dinner, the goal was to invite an interesting guest, so I invited Jacques Parizeau, who came down, and but before he came to Washington as the Wall Street Journal's guest, there were headlines all across Canada. Wall Street Journal entertains Jacques Parizeau. It was not our finest moment, I suppose. What can we do about this? What can we do about this problem that Americans, James Reston once said this of Central America, that Americans will do anything for Central America except read about it. What can we do to increase Americans' interest in Canada, knowledge of Canada, and I would go so far as to say appreciation of the gifts of Canada and the richness of life here? We'll start with you, Emma, this time.
I think there are a couple of different ways to take that. I think that focusing on border issues, areas where the story is also about the United States, it gives people a handle and a reason to pay attention. We often in radio talk about scene, and that is a way where if your scene is good enough, if you can take people to a place where an activity is happening and it is fun enough to listen to, a lot of stories can get on air based on that, right? And a lot of stories can engage people just based on your ability to really take people to a place. So that's sort of the workaround, right? Like they may not realize they care about this topic until they're sort of climbing through brush with you. Or the oddest story I got on air was the suggestion box for the universe, which if anyone was in Montreal, this was on the rail tracks in Rosemont during the pandemic. And because I was able to leave a note and find the guy who put it up and sit and go through the box with him like late at night when he goes to check the messages, you know, it's not crucial news, but because there's, you know, a real scene there, that's something that you're able to get an NPR audience to engage with.
I think it's, you know, a tough issue. I will say one thing that has been really helpful for me is that I have an editor who is the editor for the Americas, so that is Canada, Mexico, South America, Central America, the Caribbean, and he is also someone who is really passionate about Canada. He doesn't see it as like, oh, it's this small part of this broader report that I'm editing. He, you know, spent his summers in New Brunswick, and so he is often, I would say, really receptive to, you know, story ideas that, you know, maybe someone who is treating Canada as just this, you know, unimportant country would not be, and he is willing to also fight for those ideas with, you know, other editors at the newspaper. And I would also say, like Emma said, anytime you can write a story that has some U.S. connection, that, you know, tends to help. So, you know, stories where you can, you know, sort of say, okay, Canada and the United States share this problem, and here is this novel or counterintuitive or different way that Canada is going about addressing it, and, you know, sort of interrogating to what extent that solution might be possible in the United States, whether the United States has, you know, something to learn from Canada, or sort of vice versa. Canada has this problem, and here's what we can learn from the experience in, I don't know, Massachusetts 2 decades ago. So anytime you can sort of make that link, that's helpful. But then there are, certain things that are just interesting to readers because they're interesting and it wouldn't matter where in the world they were happening. An example that's coming to mind is the reports, I think it was last year or maybe the year before, about people in certain parts of New Brunswick who were experiencing symptoms of what public health officials at the time thought could be a novel neurological disorder. So the fact that it was happening in Canada was less pivotal to the story than the fact that this novel disorder might exist, and that would be the case if it was people in various other countries getting sick.
One other thought is that also if there are themes that Americans are interested in and those have echoes in Canada, like for example Hockey Canada, I think part of the interest in that was because there have been similar events and similar scandals in the U.S. So that was sort of a way for Americans to engage with that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Dan?
I echo what my colleague said. When I was covering Canada, in journalism we talk about the nut graph, the sort of why here, why now, why we should care. I sort of see Canada, there are sort of 5 big themes, indigenous rights, identity politics in Quebec, China-Canada relations, and then transatlantic relations. So any stories that I could relate to those sort of 5 themes were likely to get on my editor's radar screen and to get better coverage in the Times. The other thing I think, which Emma alluded to, when I covered the country, people love a good yarn. It doesn't really matter where it's from. So a lot of I would always try and find a device to tell the story. So for example, the never-ending story of Quebec identity politics, there's only so many times you can write about Bill 21 and Bill. But, so I wrote about franglais hip-hop, the fact that young hip-hop artists in Quebec were mixing English and French, much to the annoyance of some, government officials in Quebec, but much to the delight of artists in Montreal. Or I wrote about, one of my most read stories during my time was about the bar mitzvah photography king of Montreal, this unlikely Portuguese janitor who became the bar mitzvah photography king of the city. And then I wrote a story about bagel wars, which was really about environmentalism, but it was really a story about, Saint-Viateur versus Fairmount and what that meant for the social fabric of Montreal. So finding a way into a story through a yarn is going to get people's attention. And also just, I think, to repeat what we've already said, which is the Trudeau. If you get Justin Trudeau into a story, Americans are going to read it for better or for worse. The Trudeau legacy, the optics of Trudeau, this sort of Prince Charming who does gravity-defying yoga poses. And he's really captured the global imagination, even though he's such a vilified person in parts of Canada. I always found that was a surefire way to get attention. So I would say those are, seeing Canada through the prism of America, as my colleagues have mentioned, finding a great yarn, and trying to find sort of what are the 5 big themes that are going to get your story traction on the other side of the border.
I think the audience out here lives a different way of life than we 4 do. And I think it might be interesting if you 3 described what your lives are like, how you find stories, what you do when you get up, what do you check, what stories do you steal from the Globe? I'm waiting for one of you to steal today's Globe and Mail story on the women who fly in doctors in the north, where you get your story ideas, how you persuade, what you tell your editors, how much trouble your editors give you, what happens when you write a story and is that the end of it? Should it come back to you? Do you have to do revisions? What's your life like? And don't just say it's like hell. My life's hell. Dan, why don't you worked for the Times? Your life was hell for a while.
Oh yeah, 20 years, yeah. So, I would start my day reading my colleagues to my left and the French, the Quebec media and the Canadian media and the American media, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, my own newspaper, and the Globe and Mail, and I listen to the radio, I listen to BBC, a Global News podcast every day. So, part of the job is keeping abreast of foreign affairs. I must say, it got easier as I got older. When I was a 22-year-old correspondent, I would live in constant fear of my phone ringing and where was I going to go to a war zone? Was I going to go to this crisis? After doing it for 20 years, it gets a little bit easier insofar that you have a lot of more knowledge. I was one of the main writers for the Ukraine war feed for the New York Times, which involved sort of distilling a lot of knowledge accumulated over 20 years of covering, Brussels, so the EU and NATO, being a London correspondent, being a Paris correspondent. So geopolitically, that helped me a lot. And then, my career was littered with experiences of like being on vacation on a Greek island, having the phone ring. It was the foreign editor of the New York Times asking me if I would go to Georgia. I thought it was strange that the foreign editor of the New York Times wanted me to go to the American South, at which point she said, no, I mean like the Caucasus, Dan. And
See, when I hear the Caucasus, I think Iowa.
I left my vacation on a Greek island to go cover the war in Georgia in 2008 because too many Times correspondents at the time were on vacation and the desk was like panicking. So, I have loads of stories where, I'd be sitting one moment and the phone would ring, go to Alberta and cover the wildfires, and next thing you know, you're driving through a post-apocalyptic, road in Alberta. So life can be very frenetic, very exciting, and you're on crazy deadlines. So, for example, when there was the massacre on an indigenous reserve in Saskatoon, I believe, no, in Saskatchewan, I had to go there, figure out in a matter of hours what had happened, and write, a 1,500-word story for the New York Times that was authoritative and accurate. So I think all of us are faced with this incredible pressure to be balanced, to be accurate, and in this current internet era, to be fast. And it's incredibly, intimidating, and I think you never lose your kind of fear of messing up and fear of failure, and that's what kind of keeps you going.
I think as editors, we sometimes say to our correspondents, get out there and scratch the surface. Go ahead, Emma.
My situation is very different than the colleagues here who are on staff, in that I was a stringer. So I've
Why don't you explain what a stringer is? Sounds like violin.
I'm the sort of primary person who had been covering Canada mostly for NPR over the last couple of years, but I'm not on staff. So when I get a call like on a Sunday night and they're like, how fast can you get to Saskatoon? I can say no. Right. And sometimes I need to because I have other projects, or right now I'm in school. I think there are advantages to that, because sometimes if you think that you can't do something well, you can say no. I think there are disadvantages in that, I'm not always available, and sometimes things that I would like to see covered, I feel a little bit of guilt when I can't say yes, because, sometimes that is a difference between whether it ends up on air or not.
So, Amanda, what's your life like? Do you talk to your editor every day? Do you fight with your editor? Do you lie to your editor? I was an editor. They all lied to me. I lied to them, too. But what's your relationship with the desk? When you write a story, are you done, or do they call and bug you at all hours?
So I would say that I check in with my editor pretty much on a daily basis. It's not necessarily because I'm writing a story every day. It's just, sort of update him on what I'm working on, and sometimes, to say, oh, this happened, is this a story for us, or is it something we can, let go? I sort of, start my day reading everything. So both, the domestic press in Canada and also our international competitors. But then, as I mentioned, I also cover the Caribbean, and a big, I would say, chunk of my time sort of covering that region, which is something relatively new that I've been doing, has been covering Haiti, which in the last couple of years has left us with no shortage of stories. And so I would say it's, tricky trying to balance the two and figuring out which stories that I would love to do that I can sort of make peace with and say, I can't get to this because I'm one person and there's only so many hours in the day. But I would say also, part of my job is the Washington Post has sort of live updates feeds throughout the day usually it's on the war in Ukraine. And so during, the earlier stages of the pandemic, we would have a sort of live updates feed on the pandemic. And so part of my job was also then contributing content from Canada. So if Canada, announces, sanctions, that it's imposing sanctions on certain Russians, I might write up, a couple of graphs and send it over to them. If Canada announces, restrictions at the border because of the pandemic, then I might write that up. So it's, trying to keep an eye on, whether there are any updates that might fit in there. There are also, projects at the Post between different desks where Canada might feature. So I believe it was last year. I worked on a story with the climate and environment team, and the project was about how countries account for their greenhouse gas emissions under the Paris Climate Agreement. And so I worked with them on a story about how Canada does not count emissions from wildfires and other sort of what Canada considers natural disturbances against their Paris climate targets. So it's a little bit of, everything. In terms of when I file a story, am I done with it? No. My editor will take a look and, go through it and make it better. And then also...
Sometimes.
I would say most of the time. And then also, you might get questions from a copy editor who is going through and checking and usually saving us from making careless mistakes. If it's a big project like this climate change story that I was mentioning, those tend to have many editors, and so you might finish a draft with your main editor, and then they send that to 3 or 4 other editors who all weigh in with their own thoughts, and then you have to go through and incorporate them and send it back and make sure that it's to their liking.
So Amanda, while you have the floor, let's do a case study. The biggest story in Canada this week has been the Speaker of the House. Did you file on that?
Yes, in collaboration with some of my colleagues in DC because I was traveling.
And so what was the discussion inside the Post when you probably called in and said the Speaker of the House of Commons is about to be forced out and eventually was forced out because of the unwise or innocent, one way or the other, invitation to a Ukrainian member of the Waffen SS. Did you have to explain much more before they said it was a story, or did they say immediately they knew, or did you have to negotiate it, or what was the process?
I didn't have to twist any arms to convince someone that this is a story. My flight actually was taxiing when Anthony Rota announced in Parliament that he would be stepping aside. So, another colleague very kindly stepped in and started a story and did a great job. And then when I was in a position to sort of contribute, I did. I would say, for a story like that, one thing that is important to convey to our readers, I think, is sort of just explaining, the Speaker of the House of Commons is different from the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and sort of, American readers know that Canada has a different system of government, but they don't necessarily know all the minutiae, and that feels like something that is, important to get across. So yeah, this was not something where I had to, make a big pitch for why we should cover it.
I want to be there when you dial 202-334-6000 and try to explain the Governor General to your desk, okay? Yeah. Dan, you had something that you wanted to...
Yeah, no, continuing on what Amanda was saying, I think one of the most radical shifts in news over the past few years has been live news, and the Washington Post and the New York Times have changed the way they present the news in these vertical columns with 250-word stories kind of going down. I was heavily involved. I spent a year seconded to the New York Times live team to help with this kind of reimagining of the news. And, the New York Times will go live with reckless abandon. There's a joke among correspondents, if there's a dog loose in Central Park, let's go live. But it's kind of changed the metabolism of correspondence. Already we were operating in a 24/7 cycle because of the web, but because of live news now, you just never, the New York Times and the Washington Post are constantly going live with big stories, and so you need to mobilize. And so oftentimes you're in front of a computer feeding the beast, and it's never ending. The New York Times has the luxury of having an Asia operation, a London operation, and a North America operation based in New York. So it's 24/7, the live feed, but you work very, very long hours. And then on the question of does the work stop after you file your story? I think the Washington Post is a writer's paper. The New York Times is famously an editor's paper. So I'm jealous of Amanda. But at the New York Times, like, every story is edited twice, and it can be, it's a very heavily edited paper, and everything is scrutinized, with 2 edits. So it can be a very long, drawn-out process.
Does that make dinner sometimes a little disruptive, Dan?
Yeah, very much so. I've had so many fruit bowls in hotel rooms for dinner over 20 years that I can.
These are fruit bowls, I have to add, that he charged the New York Times for.
Back in the day, yeah.
Yes, okay. So what would you say to our audience about whether you feel it's the coverage of Canada, your own and others, is comprehensive enough? Do you think maybe the Times ought to have more people here? Should the Post have more people here? Should Emma be besieged by requests for stories, thereby enhancing her exchequer, if not her, while exhausting her? But do you think there's enough? Should we do more? We'll put aside the question. We'll also concede that what we do among the 3 of you is excellent, but how about, is it enough?
I think I will say that under-resourcing of foreign desks is a very, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn to say that's a very well-known problem in the U.S. and has only gotten more so over the last several years.
Well, one thing I will say, I was very struck when I was a correspondent that the Canadian media is very decentralized, and like local media tend to, the Vancouver media covers British Columbia, and the Toronto Globe Mail covers Bay Street in Toronto. So there's a real opportunity for like the Washington Post and the New York Times to have a global approach to stories and NPR. So that's one thing. But obviously none of these media can afford to throw resources in every province, and so invariably you end up doing thematic big picture stories. And I frankly think it's okay. Canada, is a middle power. It's not Washington. And I think you can cover Canada thematically, big picture stories, without kind of blanketing the country with correspondence. The appetite, like both the United States and internationally, is limited for Canada stories. It's just the reality.
Anybody have any?
I would agree. The Post hasn't had a Canada correspondent in a long time. And, these are decisions way above my pay grade, but of course I'd love to have more help. But when there is a big story and there is a lot of attention on Canada, then, the newspaper does mobilize resources from other desks to help. So when there were the, demonstrations in Ottawa, the so-called Freedom Convoy demonstrations in Ottawa, it wasn't like, Amanda, you are going by yourself and you have to file a story, a daily story every day by yourself, and then also we'd like you to be filing interesting enterprise stories. It wasn't all on my shoulders. There were reporters in DC who helped. There was one of my colleagues, Miriam, came up to Ottawa, so there were 2 of us on the ground in the past week. when, when the Prime Minister said in Parliament that authorities had been pursuing credible allegations that agents of the Indian government were behind the murder of a Canadian citizen in Canada, it wasn't on me to do all of the work. I worked with my colleagues in India. I worked with colleagues from desks across the newspaper, investigations, visual forensics. So when there are big stories, we do try to move people around to help. But of course, I'm like to think that I'm very collegial and would love to, have other reporters in Canada. When I'm covering Haiti, I work with an excellent reporter based in Port-au-Prince named Woodlore. So, that's another sort of relationship to manage.
Well, let's have questions from the audience.